speakers whether they have any questions to other speakers. But given the way we pose questions and answers, I fear that the audience will then never get a turn. So I'd like to start with the audience. So if anyone has a question, please pose it and say to whom you want to pose it. Please.
I have a question for...
Wait a minute, could you say your name out loud because
I'm
it's
Lisa.
recorded? Lisa?
Yes. I have a question for Stephen Frank.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, so you, so I do my master thesis in how a book theoretic constitution of objects, how you can interpret that with object structural realism. But what I don't understand is, I see how you can use Poincaré and the representations to your objects in a sense with like all the intrinsic properties. But if you use your unitary groups to get your charge, you have like an internal symmetry. And I don't know how do you deal with that, because I think if you have external symmetries, you have like a real concrete structure in a sense. But if you have a gauge symmetry and you're still using that to constitute your object, you have, is it not just an abstract structure, like, or not?
Well, let me tell you back. Why do you think it's abstract?
Because you cannot, it's not empirical, in a way. I mean, you cannot, there's no way to, like, see it in a way, yeah.
But there's a sense in which when you impose gauge invariance, and again, all this stuff drops out.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm slightly, I mean, I'm sure Kerry and Simon have got things to say about this as well, but I mean, I'm just like, my worry is always when people say, but it's not empirical, or it's not observable, or, well, no, of course not, right? Because we're talking about, unobservable stuff to begin with. So for me, it's what comes out of the symmetries and what we get out of so the fact that the photon is a gauge boson, that's a significant fact that surely tells us that the world is such that it's gauged. Yeah, and going back to that example, the reason why the colour property pushed out the paraparticle theory of quarks was because colour could be gauged in a way that then gave all these other results, right? And that seems to me, on that basis, you can then adopt a form of realism about the relevant structure.
But there is a difference in symmetries. I mean,
yeah, of course.
It takes the symmetry in space-time than in the phase of your wave function or something.
No, of course. And it's a little. Cassira lumps them all together under principle, but I think you can recognise that there are different kinds. There are internal symmetry. So the standard model, right? You talk about articulate symmetries of the standard model. You've got different kinds of symmetries. You've got space-time symmetry. You've got internal symmetry. You've got permutation symmetry. Right, so you've got different kinds of... So the structure of the world is not like a sort of, homogeneous, monolithic type structure. It's actually very complex and interesting. You've got these different features. I don't know, Kerry, do you want to...
Well, David had a finger on this.
Yeah.
You said something like the world is gauged, or the world is such that something with gauge holds of it. That just strikes me as... It makes me a bit uneasy because gauge symmetry is supposed to be this, paradigm case of a descriptive redundancy in our description of the world. So when we have a gauge symmetry in our mathematics, we're thereby claiming there's no residual of gauge in the world.
Right.
There is no variable that we ascribe to a physical thing that varies with a gauge symmetry.
Right.
So we're claiming that a gauge symmetry is not part of the world, not as an object, not as a structure. It's just not there at all. So in what sense, it doesn't even make sense to say, and I'm just being really provocative here, that the world is gauged in some way.
Could I just... Yeah, cool. Can I come in on this? We have a... Well, there'll be a short lecture.
the sort of thing I was talking about earlier, where you've got some sort of so there exists U, and you've got some new predicate U X. So something like this. Okay, now you can preface it by universal quantifiers, but the point is that this thing is really expressing a gauge degree of freedom, essentially. And in this case, it's that you translate relative to space matter, relative to space. That's usually called the rigid symmetry. You could do something similar for a gauge symmetry. Now, the point about a structure like that is you can connect this U in this bound quantification to other complex predicates. You can connect it in this way to end up something which is has enormously more structure than if you did not avail yourself of this gauge symmetry. It's a real structure to the world.
Yeah.
And this is an invariant, gauge invariant predicate, but it's built into it a lot of complexity that you can only arrive at through gauging.
Yes.
So it is subtle, and I don't say that I've got to the bottom of it. I mean, all of us have trouble in explaining why is the gauge principle so important.
Yeah.
It is. But I think there is, we can get some leverage on this question.
Yeah. So when I said the world is gauge, I meant that.
Maybe just to rephrase Sam a little bit is that you can, so you have this one description which has gauge and variance. So you see things changing in it, and you see a certain aspect of that variant. And then one project is to say, how can I, maybe there is a way to just talk about the invariant stuff. And this is, of course, a way to talk about the invariant stuff. We still have a residue.
Well, that's right. It's got an embedded ontological commitment to something that's gauging.
But be quantified out.
But you're doing it in such a way that you don't actually violate the principle of sufficient reason.
But the residue in this case of gauge symmetries, in a sense, still just a descriptive residue. It's not like I've just found the best way I could give to talk about the invariant stuff, the stuff that really is out there. I'm not.
But in talking about the invariant stuff, you've managed to do it in a way which incorporates something that is gauge. And the point of that thing which is engaged is it allows you to say something much richer than you could otherwise. I mean, it's already, I think it's already demonstrated in the predicate calculus. I think I can demonstrate something like that.
But isn't there, I mean, I thought the point of the question is that there is something different happening with gauge symmetries and non-symmetries.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. So I would say something like, the gauge principle says something about the connection between matter fields and force fields. And that's the content of it. But I don't think that the representational role of gauge symmetries is the same as the representational role of non-gauge symmetries, right? And for the reason that David said, which is to say that we don't have any reason to believe that the transformations, the changes of gauge, correspond in any way to real transformations. Whereas
But neither do these. I mean, neither do translations of matter relative to space. It's not a real physical. You don't arrive at a physically distinct state of affairs.
no, but translations in general do have.
Look, isn't this a way you sorry, this might be too.
David's just a
If you think of permutation symmetry, right, you can think of permutation symmetry in terms of actually moving the particles around in some kind of configuration space, right?
Yeah.
Or you just think of it in terms of you've got this permutation operator. Right? You're not actually thinking of some kind of physical transformation in that sense.
But in
Right.
space-time, it's in space-time, so you do make really a rotation.
Yeah, but doesn't that just speak to the point that if you just talk about the structure of the world, right? There are, as it were, different features, or how we want to put it, of that structure. Some of those features correspond to space-time symmetries. Some of those features correspond to permutation symmetry. Some of those features are, I don't want to say correspond to, because David or but some of those features are characterized in terms of gauge invariance, or making our theories gauge invariant. And the fact that we gauge invariant theories are successful give us reason to suppose there's a feature of the world
Yeah.
Right.
that is somehow characterizing.
But how to articulate?
How to articulate
In a
it?
gauge invariant way.
Yeah.
You're trying to articulate the gauge in a gauge invariant way.
Yeah.
And I
Wait a
think we
minute,
can make
wait a
some
minute.
progress with it.
Sean had a finger on this?
Yeah, I have a finger. Just so one of the things that always puzzles me about like
Louder, please.
louder.
A little bit.
I'm speaking down. That's why. That always puzzles me about attributing taking too seriously gauge would be like I can just append extra degrees of freedom that are symmetric. I could kill them mathematically. So for example, like if I did general relativity in metric variables, or connection variables, or Ashtekar variables, I'm adding structure, but like, should I think that that's extra structure in the world, or is it just something I'm putting in for mathematical convenience, or is there like an ideal amount of gauge that I should add that I should take seriously?
Yeah, about that one.
About that one,
But I mean, no,
that's the puzzle that
No, but you're always going to have surplus, again, I mean, you're always going to have the possibility of surplus structure, right? And so you have to somehow have some ground for deciding, okay, which structure are we going to take a realist stance towards, and which are we going to somehow excise as surplus? I don't.
Right, so the funny thing about gauge is it's not surplus in the sense that you need it, but I think you don't need it. What I think what you need it for is to represent curvature and non-trivial topology. So in any context in which you've got non-trivial topology and curvature, then you just can't do things without local symmetry, because you need to be able to go from one patch to another in order to describe things, right? And so in order to go from one patch to another, you need gauge invariance so you can make things like one patch on the overlap. So, right.
Okay, another question. Who had another question? Theo first.
Well, I'm not an expert on structural realism, but my field is truth approximation, and I have a question, I think, first of all to James and Stephen, but maybe others also want to answer. Assuming a domain of phenomena and a vocabulary, and my first question is, are there one or more true or correct structures? Of course, plausibly unknown, but nevertheless they could exist, the true structure or a true structure in a given context. And if so, is it then meaningful to say that one structure may be closer to the truth than another structure? One structure may be closer to the true structure than another structure. And, well, if both answers are positive, then can I assume that truth approximation is within the structuralist, realist view? Is that possible?
Yes.
Just all
Yes.
that, all that.
Wow!
And has it been, because I do not, has it been formally described how this
It has, but as Fred pointed out, it's never been published. I'm kidding. I mean, so the notion of partial truth that Da Costa tried to formalize, I think, can be used in that way. But I've not. He and I have not presented it in the detail that, for example, you have in your work. But I do think it could be applied in that way.
so that's
Could I just have a disagreeing note? I mean, in case Unity breaks up. So within my sort of objectival sort of way of thinking about it, as guided by a theory, the real question is how good is the theory at exploration? Exploring a domain. How good is it at exploring a domain? That sounds instrumentalist, doesn't it? You know, the laws are just instruments. But I don't think that's quite the right way to think about it. Within this business of exploration, there's local truth. You know, that you did indeed. You know, you went and explored and you found this thing, and that's locally true or false. But in terms of a large, big question of truth, it's hard to know what that would mean.
Can I ask a question? I mean, when you talk about exploration, are you talking? So there's one sense of exploration which literally exploring the world, like we murder stuff. Right? The other is we're exploring theoretical space.
No, it's more than murder. Though.
Right.
I really do mean it literally, and I think this is a matter for experimentalists. It's the experimentalists who are kind of really doing the physical exploring. Of course, the theoreticians are trying to figure out ways to assist the experimentalists in doing those explorations. I know this isn't maybe only attractive to a philosopher, but I think it's a better take on what actual science is all about.
But that can't be. I mean,
Why can't it?
well, because I mean, there's so much of the progress of science can be attributed to theoretical advances
Yeah.
that are not immediately driven by.
If-
It's not like it's not like
No, sure.
it is not the case that experimentalists stumble over stuff
Sure.
and they say, "Oi, bring the theoretician in. Let's explain this."
Sure. And there's a whole range of experimentally discovered stuff that maybe the experimentalists aren't particularly paying attention to anymore. You know, that's all
Yeah,
done
yeah.
and dusted. And the theoreticians are thinking, well, do we really understand this domain that is thus being shown to us? And maybe there's another way to do it, and you can rejig it. And those rejiggings, when they're dramatic, you know,
Yeah,
fail.
yeah.
That would be very meaningful.
But I don't see how that is disagreeing with the kind of line
Well,
that Teo
I think,
might push.
I mean, it's just a sense that all of us in philosophy of science have got too hung up on truth. You know, and as soon as you make truth the issue, the goal, truth, fundamental theory of the world, how do you know you've ever got there? You know, how do you, what does truth consist in? And you're led into metaphysical speculations that don't seem to deliver anything. So I just feel there's a place for truth, of course, but I think it maybe is better understood as local rather than global truth or the theory of everything.
Oh, but I would perfectly agree with that.
I think Manali had a question.
Yeah, well, actually a question for Stephen and also for Simon, but maybe I'll start with Stephen. So this is a follow-up to Carrie's question to you, that what you meant by what the concept of existential, I think, witness it was, I think, is essentially just the idea of initial conditions imposed on laws. And it seems like you more or less agreed that you could think of the idea of an existential witness as just the notion of initial conditions. You didn't really seem to say what it was about existential witnesses that was somehow distinct from the idea of initial conditions. So I was puzzled, why talk about existential witnesses and determinables instead of just saying, let's just add initial conditions to laws and symmetries to define structure.
Yeah, because I think we should have time for other people on the panel to say stuff like this one. Existential witness seems much a more general notion than initial conditions. Initial conditions comes freighted with a certain baggage. If you mean by initial conditions, as it were, those conditions at however far back we're able to go, right, that set the structure of the world unfolding in a certain way. And if you include under those initial conditions, right, and this is not what most people don't do, because most philosophers of science don't really think about what initial conditions are for the most part. If you include among those initial conditions the fact that we live in this bubble in the multiverse is one in which there are only Fermi, Dirac, and Bose-Einstein statistics. If you're willing to accept that as part of your initial conditions, right? As far as I know, no one's ever said anything like that. Then yeah, existential witnesses equals initial conditions, right? But I'm thinking of some, typically I use it because it embraces that stuff as well, that we live in a bosonic fermionic world rather than a parabosonic or fermionic world. We live in a world in which the Poincare group hold. We live in a world that Pache, David, is gauge invariant in the following way and understood in the following sense. All of that, if you want to pack that into initial conditions, yeah, fine, whatever. But that's not how initial conditions are usually understood. So I prefer the term existential witnesses, just to say, and it is just a, it is just a label that says, out of the multifarious mathematical possibilities, these are the ones that are actual.
This contingent.
So it sounds, first of all, I think you should say boundary conditions, not initial conditions.
Right, yeah, sorry.
Because you don't want a temporal component there. But I think you should resist saying more than you've said, right? Just because you just fall into that trap.
Yeah,
because it sounds very similar to an instantiation. It sounds very similar to saying, well, yeah, but some of it's instantiated.
Well, this goes back to the
And
question.
then people say, well, it's a mystery, you know, and it's what I describe as the mystery of like what breathes fire into the equations. Right?
Yeah,
And you say, oh, it's the cosmic dragon.
That was,
You know,
that was Simon's
like,
point.
you can say anything you want. It doesn't really matter. I mean, because you're not going to have any resources that you're going to get from inside reality to tell you what the difference is between what's actual and what's merely possible.
In a way,
what could possibly do that?
This
So
is
you better
Simon's
just
point about
extend it and say,
inexpressibility. It's Simon's point, I think, about inexpressibility when you're saying the reality, you know, the equations are, you know, reality.
Right.
It goes back
It's
to
the
the point we were
concreteness.
talking about earlier. But yeah, how do you? I think it goes, you've got all these mathematical possibilities. What is the difference between those and this, right? The bosonic and fermionic. And you can talk about concrete, but what does that consist in? How do we make that distinction? And you get to a point where you're absolutely right, you just can't say anymore except use a label like this, existential witnesses. We live in a bosonic and fermionic world. So, Jonathan.
I mean, this is a point where the issue of whether there's an object instantiating some of these properties is potentially helpful. Because you could say what the reason why this structure is witnessed is because it's the one the world instantiates. These other ones aren't witnessed because they're not instantiated by the world. Or if you don't want a world or some kind of thing instantiating the structural properties, you could just take it as a further primitive fact that some of these structures just have another primitive predicate for being a fire, or being actual, or something like that.
Yeah.
But it seems like here, I would think there's pressure for some added resource beyond the structure. Either an instantiator of the structure to distinguish the ones that are on fire from the ones that aren't, or a primitive predicate just to label the ones. Something.
Okay, someone else in the audience?
I had a comment about
If the audience falls mute, then I let the...
David.
We've been talking a lot about instantiation of things, properties by objects, but it seems like there is something of a linguistic issue going on, because I don't say, at least in normal language, we don't tend to say the apple instantiates redness, so we say the apple is red. If I say the apple instantiates redness, I'm treating the property as kind of in an object position, but the property isn't an object. The property is the kind of thing that combines with an object to form a sentence, like an apple is red. Is the property we're talking about. So the matter of instantiation, in a sense, to me doesn't seem to come up. Only if I treat properties and relations as objects does it come up. In the sentence position of an object. But that's not what properties do. That's kind of an abuse of language almost. So I'm not so sure this kind of instantiation business is actually, what is the instantiation relation? It doesn't seem to me to be a genuine problem.
I wanted to ask about something different, so if somebody wants to follow up on this issue. I wanted to actually just ask James, really just to invite him to say a little bit more about something you mentioned in your talk that I was really curious about. Because I want to understand real patterns, what you think about them now. So I find that a very suggestive idea. But I have to admit, when I read about it in the book, I had a little bit of trouble getting my head around it because I wasn't sure whether you were presenting a univocal conception of it. So on the one hand, there was talk of compression of information. There was also talk of non-redundancy. I wasn't sure that those two things were always coextensive in examples I could think of. So those were two things. In your talk, you mentioned that you now are not sure that the account that you gave in the book works. So I'd like to know why that is, and how are you thinking about it now?
Okay. I mean, it's not easy to answer that quickly, and I don't want to go on for too long. So I'll say the reason I don't think it works is that because a chap in Barcelona wrote this paper where he took a definition we gave and showed that it didn't work, and it has to do with how we talk about projectable. So I think the technical kind of definition that we give needs to be modified. I think that the talk about the bitmap is really metaphorical. So, you know, one needs to do better. And question of redundancy versus, what was it you said? Redundancy versus compressibility. Yeah, so the thought is something like, if you, okay, in the ordinary case of let's take a map, a sequence of numbers, right? For that to be compressible, is for it to be exactly reproducible given less information than the whole, or for it to be exactly reproducible from something that's easier to state, shorter to state. But then think, whenever we have, in almost all scientific examples, there's a kind of loss of information. So we never, you know, Kepler's laws aren't sort of compressed by Newton's second law because they're actually corrected by it at the same time. To go in a different direction, you know, the ideal gas laws give you a compression of information other than by quantifying over all the positions of all the molecules, but they're false, strictly speaking. You go.
I'm sorry. Okay, say goodbye to Simon.
Bye.
So I think, you know, we've got to be careful when we transplant notions from computer science or information theory or algorithmic compressibility theory into the philosophy of science, because there are ways in which it's analogous and ways in which it isn't. So, does that help a bit?
Yeah, that helps. So what about non-redundant statistics?
Right, so the thought is
Before you answer, could you elaborate a little bit of this last? I didn't understand the question.
Well, the question was really asking James to say what he meant, because he just mentioned it in his talk. This might be a third way of understanding what a real pattern
Okay.
is. Right? But I don't know what it is.
And the real
right. So
pattern is
the thought is something like
in terms of non-redundant statistics.
yeah. So whatever statistical regularities there are, you might think are real, but you wouldn't want to double count, so you want it to be non-redundant. That's right. So I don't know, if I know that all ravens are black, and I know that ravens are corvids, and I know that all corvids are black, then my knowledge that all ravens are black is redundant relative to the rest of what I know. Right? So we don't want to say there's an extra component of reality to the real pattern of our ravens, right? But if I didn't know anything about corvids and all I was talking about was ravens, then it wouldn't, relative to that description, it wouldn't be redundant anymore to say ravens are ravens. So, you know, I think the problem is the world is sort of messy. Science is usually capturing things in an approximate, probabilistic, statistical fashion. And so for that reason, you've got to be super careful about how you move back and forth between sort of formal representations of our knowledge of the world, which is always going to be our partial knowledge of part of the world, rendered formally, and the world, right? And so in everything that's go, like a lot of things we try to do, we didn't maybe pull it off, but we tried to distinguish between formal mode and material mode so that we could sort of say, when I'm talking about in formal mode, I'll talk about structure. When I'm talking in material mode, I'll talk about real patterns, or the things, or the stuff, or whatever. But, you know, most of the time, we're working with representations of the world, obviously. We can't talk about the world without representing it. And then some of what we say is different depending on how we're presenting. So, not very helpful, is it?
Other questions?
Kerry.
Kerry, please.
Okay, I've got a question for James too.
Hi.
Okay, following on from my question before. Okay, so suppose, right, let's, same premise, right? Classical physics, great theory, it's an effective theory, and so its laws are approximately true. Suppose I also buy into this real patterns criterion about ontologies. I can say classical stuff, like that which it posits is kind of around. So let's suppose all that classical laws are approximately true, classical stuff in some sense exists at some scale. What naturalists are going to say is that the metaphysics of classical physics and the metaphysics of, say, quantum field theory are radically different. Which, that's your motivation for naturalism, right? It changes as the metaphysics changes as your physical brain has to, right? Now, suppose that analytic metaphysicians had been doing the metaphysics of classical physics right? It wasn't some, popular mechanics version of classical physics. It was classical physics, right? And suppose that they argued on that basis that the metaphysics of classical physics is, deterministic, local, perhaps maybe humanism is more, if you don't have entanglement, maybe that's the right metaphysics for classical physics. So suppose that turns out to be the right metaphysics of classical physics, right? Suppose I'm right, that we've agreed the metaphysics of quantum field theory, this metaphysics of classical physics are going to be radically different with regard to locality, perhaps with regard to humanism, with regard to things like whether objects have transcendental identity, with regard like intrinsicality of properties, and so on and so forth. Suppose I'm right that these two forms of metaphysics don't stand, they're incompatible, they tell completely different stories, and there's no nice relations of continuity between them in the way that there are in physics, that you get to the corresponding principle and so on. Would you want to agree with what I would say in the face of this, which is that to metaphysicians, the only place that you have deep metaphysics is at the fundamental level. You can't have it in both places because they're incompatible. There's no reconciling relation. They're radically different. There's no reconciling relation between them like you have in physics through correspondence, through approximation, through all that lovely relations of deformation and continuity and so on and so forth. So you've got to pick one, and the fundamental stuff seems like that's the better place to have deep metaphysics.
Good.
So that's where we do, you can do a kind of first order finding on ontology, right? These are the laws, and maybe even these are the object, or this is the stuff. But the categories that you have, what primitive ideology you have, whether you have modality and so on, the deep metaphysical, big M metaphysical questions, they apply to the fundamental stuff. Those applying fundamental regimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've articulated very clearly that conception lots of people have, and it's just not the one I have. So for the following reasons. So one, I would say, you just couldn't do the metaphysics of classical physics, because what would that mean? I mean, classical, if you mean something like, by first of all, you've got to tell me where you're talking about Newtonian classical physics?
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, so Newtonian classical physics doesn't have a metaphysics, because Newton says, right, I'm interested in bodies that can be described such that they can be treated as if their centre of mass is, their mass is concentrated at the centre, and then it's a matter of, as Newton himself says, of the kind of the ability of that theory to model reality. It doesn't come with an ontology. I mean, the ontology is supplied from outside, right? There are planets. Now I want to describe them. It doesn't. You can't look in classical physics and see there are planets. So now the other point I would make is.
So there's no metaphysics of what classical fields, so the local and.
I don't understand what that means, right? So I think metaphysics is the attempt to say how, as we say in the book, we get from Sellers, the job of the metaphysician is to say how science as a whole hangs together. So therefore, the idea of doing the metaphysics of a partial, incomplete, false theory, like what would it be to do that? I mean, one thing to say is that the metaphysics of classical physics is the metaphysics of the quantum world, because the classical world is the quantum world in. I mean, this is how the quantum world looks.
Yeah.
The stability of matter is explained by quantum mechanics.
But that's a very reductionist, that's an explicitly reductionist claim that the ontology of classical physics is quantum physics.
Well, I don't think there's a separate classical world and then a quantum world. I mean, so if you want to say I'm reductionist for denying that, okay, but I mean, it's a bit like when people say, I want to tell you about the metaphysics of classical. Well, like doing the metaphysics of non-relativistic many-particle quantum mechanics. Right? What quantum mechanics in theory was developed to understand particles moving in fields. Right? Those fields are not described by quantum mechanics. So the empirical adequacy of the theory depends on its incompleteness as an account of reality. Because you have to put in by hand that there's a Coulomb potential. Right? So you put in, there just never was this, a theory that could be a theory of everything, call it quantum mechanics. What would the world be like if quantum mechanics was exactly true? I just sort of think that question doesn't make any sense. I don't understand the project of doing something like, suppose the world was exactly like classical electromagnetism says, what would that be like? It's like, well, as far as I can see, there's no reason to believe there could be any such world.
Do you think that our current theories are in any different?
No.
Have a different stuff, so we can't do metaphysics at all until the end of time?
Well, you take that line, or you say, no, the job of metaphysics is to try to reconcile the theories we have at different scales and in different domains and different regimes. So, for example, I would describe it as a substantive advance in metaphysics is understanding quantum chemistry, for example, or the kinetic theory of gases, or the kinetic theory of heat. Right? I would think of those things as metaphysics. Now, this is why, I'm not doing the same kind of metaphysics that lots of people are. I mean, they may be right to do what they're doing. It's really like an orthogonal kind of project.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone else in the audience, the last word, is 6 o'clock. No urgent questions. You rarely see a bunch of such high-powered, informed philosophers on this subject together, so this is your opportunity. But you know it all. Okay.
I do think we should just say, though, I think we should be careful about expecting a view to do too much. And I think we don't want structural realism to be like an account of truth and why is there space-time, and because those are questions that we're not in a position to answer just in virtue of having a reasonable philosophy of science.
Yeah, I mean,
okay, James, these are your last words then. Let me ask any of the speakers whether they want to give us last words, wise words.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
You want?
Oh, I thought Jonathan was speaking for all of us. Yeah.
Oh, John.
Any last words I have are in the Mueller report. You should read that.
Okay. No one? Well, then the conference ends here. Thank you all for your work.
Last words, Kerry?
Yeah. Anyone last words? Wise words for the audience?
So I feel like I'm losing I feel like I'm losing my grip on instruction.
Oh dear. We don't want to let you go home like that.
There's a progress in its own way.
But isn't that a good thing? I mean, a position, like James said, a position shouldn't be set in stone and then become fossilized. It should be something that evolves, and people here should be taking bits of it and saying, well, actually, I've got my version of ontic structuralism that does this, or I'm going to see if I can apply the notion of structure to biology and do this, and it becomes more fluid. And the old farts are like, no, that's not what we meant, and you can say, tough. You're the old guys, we're taking over, we're doing it this way now. That's the way it should be. That's the way how we move and progress in philosophy, isn't it?
It's a bit dichotomous, we're not, there's old and there's old.
It's a spectacle.